Hello, my love, and welcome back to the Organic Marketing Simplified. Today's episode is about how to effectively grow your podcast. Now, there are 3 ways that I recommend, and guess what? Before I give you these tips, let me share with you what we're not doing to grow our podcast. We're not going to spend hours creating reels or TikToks or, other short form content to promote our podcast. And this is why. Because if I'm on Instagram, if I, as a consumer, made the decision to go on Instagram, I am in a certain mindset. What I don't want is for me to go on Instagram for you to tell me to then go to a podcast for me to hear about your show. Maybe, yes, I do want to hear about it and it's something that I'm going to consider. I'm not going to get off of Instagram to go to your podcast. It's something that's going to go to the back of my head, and maybe if I remember later, I will do it. The number one thing that you need to remember when it comes to podcasts is that not everybody enjoys podcasts. A lot of people do, but some people don't. Some people like to consume their content differently, but you have to remember this. Podcast listeners listen to podcasts. So you need to put in all of your energy into the podcast itself to grow your show. Stop with this idea that you're going to grow your podcast in outside platforms, because that's really not going to help you. And it's going to burn you out. Now, if you have a podcast and you want to record video and you want to strip the audio and you want to do a blog, and from the video you want to make reels and you want to post on YouTube and you want to do all these other things, go ahead and do that. But don't think that by you doing a video of your podcast and making reels that is actually going to help you grow your podcast. Because again, if I'm going on TikTok or if I'm going on Instagram and I have this very specific idea of what I want to do with my time right now, I'm not going to podcast, right? So usually if I'm in the mindset of going to Instagram, it's because I want to stalk somebody. I want to numb out. I want to waste some time. Let's call it for what it is. I might be in the bathroom and scrolling. I'm not on Instagram in this moment in time, but those are the things that I was doing back when I was using Instagram. And I bet that you are doing a lot of the same things when you go to Instagram, when you go to TikTok. Like, nobody goes to TikTok or Instagram because they want to learn something. So the mindset is different, which is why growing your podcast is different. And you have to treat it the same, right? So, this idea that we're going to grow a podcast by promoting more on Instagram, it blows my mind that people actually are falling for that. And I don't understand why people keep promoting that as a way to grow your podcast. It's great for your Instagram, for you to post some reels. It's not really going to do anything for your podcast, if we're being super honest. So yes, it's great for reach on Instagram and TikTok or whatever else. It's not really going to do much for your podcast. So now with that out of the way, the number one way for you to grow your podcast is through SEO. That is the number one way for you to grow your podcast is by you focusing on SEO. I have a ton of episodes on this podcast talking about SEO. So make sure that you go back and listen and apply those things that you listen on this podcast about SEO, so that you can actually conquer. That is the easiest, lowest hanging fruit, is by focusing on SEO. And even if you don't like SEO, you hate SEO, you don't get SEO, you don't know what it is, I got your back. I have a free guide that I leave linked in the show notes for you. In the free guide, I will walk you through how to do keyword research, where to put the keyword, and how it helps. So make sure that you go ahead and get it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about SEO because I have a ton of other episodes that you can go ahead and listen to, and I'll link those down below so you can go ahead and binge listen after this episode. But that is by far the number one way that you're going to grow your podcast, is by focusing on SEO. The number 2 way that you're going to grow your podcast is by podcast guesting, is by you being a guest on other people's show. Now, you may think that if you get some huge podcaster or influencer of some sort or celebrity on your show, that's going to do wonders for you and your growth. But here's the thing, my love. Here's the thing that you need to understand, is that you're taking the time to promote somebody else on your show. And you might get a spike in downloads for that specific episode. But the reason for that is because people are coming after that person that you're interviewing. And it does not mean that they're going to stick around, right? So like, let's say, you have some really famous person on your podcast and you see a spike in downloads for that day. Chances are you're not going to remain with having a spike in downloads for the following episodes, because the person who is here listening to that specific episode is here for that specific person, and they're not going to stick around. So even though you might give a little spiel in the beginning of your podcast and talk about who you are and blah, 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 chances are like the audience is not going to stick around. So if you want to go ahead and interview some huge person, some celebrity, whatever, go ahead and do that. I'm not going to stop you. I think, if you can build those connections, because you're not always going to have a monetary return, right? Like sometimes it's about building those connections and networking, because networking, it is a super valuable asset. But just know that you interviewing somebody else and highlighting somebody else, yes, you might get a spike in downloads for that particular episode. It might not stick around. So with that being said, you guesting on other people's podcasts, that is how you can grow your podcast, because you're highlighting your expertise, you're talking to other podcasters, and podcast listeners listen to podcasts, right? So if you want to grow your podcast, don't go to TikTok, go to the podcast, go to other shows and share your expertise, and then call them over to come hang out with you whenever the episode is over. So that is how you build your podcast. So that is the second way for you to grow your show. The third way for you to grow your show is called podcast swapping. So what it looks like is I have a show, you have a show, we have similar audiences. I go on your show and talk about my expertise, and then you come on my show and talk about your expertise. So then, we're kind of sharing audiences and kind of growing our influence that way. We're networking, we're doing things together, and that is a great way for you to also grow your show. It looks a lot like podcast guesting. The only difference is in podcast guesting, you are actually going on other people's shows, and that's it. And then podcast swapping, they come on your show and you go on their show. For people who have a high ratio of interview shows, it's much easier for you to get on their show and just talk about whatever. And usually podcasters who have that kind of format when they're interviewing people, they are looking for people to come on their show and share expertise, because at some point you kind of start to run out of people to invite on your show, But podcast swap is great for people who just want to get that yes. So you have to think one thing, that as podcasters, we're getting a lot of pitches in our inbox every single day. So how we can secure a yes to be on somebody else's show is by saying, hey, I'll go on your show, you come on my show. How about, we share audiences. So then you're highlighting the benefits, and it's not like this kind of one-way street. For some podcasters, podcast guesting can feel like a one-way street, whereas podcast swapping feels like, okay, I'm actually getting something out of this interaction, and some podcasters will be more inclined. So it's up to you which route you want to go. I wouldn't say limit yourself to only podcast guesting or only podcast swapping. Try both and see what works. But the point is, the main thing you need to get from this episode is that podcast listeners listen to podcasts. And if you're thinking that you're going to post a reel on Instagram or a TikTok and whatever, and then you're hoping that that person is going to stop what they're doing and then come and listen to your show, that's probably not going to happen. Another thing too is that while they might be hooked and they might be interested, right? They might make a mental note to come listen to you on your podcast, but they might forget. And let's face it, we all forget things all the time. So think about you and your day-to-day life and how forgetful you get. So let's put that out there. But two, they might just end up following you on that platform, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whatever. They might just stay on that platform, and you're growing that platform, but you have to think that it is, a very short-term attention span kind of platform, so probably that person is following you hundreds, if not thousands of other people. So your content is not now competing with them. So just understand that every platform has a goal, and the goal of Instagram is not to get people off of Instagram to go to whatever. The goal of TikTok is not to get people out of TikTok to go listen to our podcast. So keeping those things in mind, those are the best 3 ways for you to grow your podcast. Is number 1, SEO. Like I said, this is the best way. This is the number 1 thing that you need to focus on. It's entirely within your control. And then podcast guesting, podcast swapping. The one thing I would say with podcast guesting and podcast swapping is that it's a numbers game. So don't feel defeated if you send out 10 pitches to be on somebody else's podcast, or even 10 pitches to podcast swap, and you don't hear back from people, or people say no, because podcasters are getting flooded with pitches in their inbox, which brings me to the next point. And I should actually do a whole other episode on this, but I'll give you a little bonus tip here. Do not mass email people and make life easy and just copy and paste. Actually take the time to understand the person whose podcast you're trying to be on or podcast swap with. Because if you're just sending like this mass email that just sounds very, very robotic, like straight out of ChatGPT, like you're going to get ignored. It happens to me all the time, and it just is what it is. It's the truth. Like if you wanted to come on my show and have access to my platform, to the people that I have worked so hard to build a connection with, like you have to do better than just to send me a mass email, just, hey, I want to be on your show. Like that does not work. So be thoughtful with your pitches. Anyway, my love, I really hope that this episode has been super insightful. And now you know the 3 ways to grow your podcast that are actually effective, that are actually going to grow, that you can actually see a return on investment on. This is it. And until next time, may you find God's love, peace, mercy, and grace. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.